New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hi, I'm Dr. Debra Lynne Katz, and I'm a guest host on the New Thinking Aloud produced by Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. And today I would like to introduce somebody. We have a surprise guest and someone who both looks a lot like me and sounds a lot like me. And that would be none other than my twin sister, Amy Beth Katz. Amy has specialized in depth psychology and communications, and she also is an intuitive reader and practitioner. But when she's not doing that, she is going all over the country and sometimes to other countries, such as recently having been in Europe and even spent one night in Ukraine documenting what was happening over there. She usually runs out whenever she hears of anything going on, particularly in relation to protests, demonstrations, marches. And for the past 14 years, she's been attending demonstrations and protests all over the world. So we're going to talk about that, comparing her experiences at different protests then and now, starting with the Occupy Wall Street movement and going to the present, discussing her observations as she has visited many college campuses where protests are taking place today. So let's get started.
Occupy Wall Street, like almost everything in my life, has been very emergent. I was not a professional photojournalist at that time, but I was very much having a strong impulse to record and document what I was seeing around me. And I was going to the University of Alaska to teach for a month. I was a professor at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. And I saw an announcement about a protest, and I had seen, of course, on the news that this was starting to happen all around the world. So I went out with my camera and I just started to record.
And since that time, I know you've published quite a few photos and videos. About how many publications have you had?
Approximately 500.
And can you tell us some of the publications that your photos have been featured in?
Yes. I have often been featured in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, ABC News, NBC, CBS, Mother Jones, pretty much any newspaper that you can think of here in the U.S., but also especially in Europe. The top magazines in almost every country. And I should say it was about 2018 that I actually started to sell my work for money. I have been distributing through Zuma Press, which is an international photo distribution company, one of the largest and oldest in the world. So I take photos and then I send them out on an FTP newswire. They go through Zuma's newswire out across the world. So editors of TV stations, newspapers, magazines, books, they see them, or as they're coming through the newswire, or they can search on the database and select the photos. So they choose the ones they want, and then they make agreements with Zuma for licensing.
One of the reasons why I wanted to do this interview was because you would often come back from covering a protest and you would have insights that I really wasn't hearing on the major news networks or elsewhere. And then sometimes I would see your footage and I'd be quite surprised at what I was seeing because you weren't seeing that on regular television. Can you tell us about that?
I think because my initial involvement was both as a journalist and a protester, I really got an inside view of what was going on. I also studied ethnography as a research tool when I was in a graduate program at the University of Denver and at Southern Illinois University. So I, have tools for observing and really trying to see things from the inside out. And so even when I have been covering protests like the more recent pro-Palestinian protests, where I am not so much identifying with the protesters as I have in many other protests, I am still trying to see things from their perspective. So that's number one. Another thing is because I am a contract photojournalist, some people would call me it's similar to a freelancer. I'm not employed directly by a news station, and the news stations tend to send out reporters, news anchors, where, they'll just be on like for a short period of time. So they may be out there for an hour or two preparing. Maybe they'll find a couple of people to interview. But pretty much once they do their news show, it's over and they go on to something else. For me, when I go to a protest site, I may stay there anywhere from 3 hours to 16 hours. When I was photographing the Black Lives Matter protests, I would go to a city and I would stay for 3 days, 5 days, even a couple of weeks. And then go out at all different times. So most reporters are not going after, say, 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And the protest scenes very much change as far as who is coming out to protest, the nature of the interactions, the level of intensity, the level of violence. All of these things change at different times of the night.
So can you list off which protests you've attended over the years?
Well, I have been to women's marches, to environmental protests. I've also covered strikes, like I covered the recent Hollywood writers' strike. During the George Floyd protests, I went all over the USA. I started in Washington, D.C., and then I ended up coming back to California. I went to Hollywood. That was mind-blowing because the National Guard had been called in, even before any protest, but it was COVID at that time. So stores were empty, and there was a lot of fear at that time that Los Angeles any protest was going to devolve into what had happened with the Rodney King riot, back a couple of decades ago. So luckily that did not happen. The Los Angeles protests and the Hollywood one, which was very, very small, very tame. People were very, in LA, there was a lot. I'd say there's probably like 1,000 people there, but people were very polite, courteous. The mood was very somber. People were very grief-stricken. This wasn't that long after George Floyd had been killed, but it was very calm and very civil.
Wasn't that the one where the National Guard was present?
In Hollywood. So I don't know who had made the decision to call in the National Guard, but they were out there at least for several days. And it was just in a way quite casual. There were soldiers with tanks. So it was very much about a show of force. And they were just on different street corners hanging out. And in fact, there wasn't that many people out on the streets at the time, but those who were coming down past Grauman's Chinese Theater or the Avenue of the Stars, where there's stars in the cement, the soldiers were posing with people. Even when I went and asked if I could take their photo, some of them asked if I wanted my picture taken with them, which at first was like, well, no, I'm a journalist. I'm here to take your photo. But I think I posed with a couple of them. So that was kind of funny. And then when the protest actually started, it was, I'd say, mostly African-American, young adults, maybe college age, and they came out with a boombox. There was a table with food and some information, but that was really like a dance party, and it was just like probably 40 people were there, and they danced to music and held signs. And so I photographed up close. I photographed from across the street, and that was about it. And then I went to the LA one, which was it took about 20 minutes to get to that one. So after LA, then I went and I took a road trip to the east, and I went to Louisville. I went to the Ohio protests. I ended up going up to Rochester and back down to Washington, D.C. And then I ended up flying to Seattle because I had heard about the CHOP zone, the Chaz zone. That was a big thing on the news. And then I ended up in Portland, and that was crazy.
Yeah, talk about that. What happened when you got to Portland? But before that, the CHOP zone you were talking about, remind us what that was all about and what did you observe? And again, we're talking about the George Floyd protests.
Anyone I went to, I heard about on TV, and they made it sound quite scary, that it was very rough, that there had been violence. So I was quite scared to go to many of them. But most of them, when I got there, it was truly peaceful. And they were a combination of kind of a memorial service, where people were really grieving, but there was also a sense of joy. And I think a large part of that was the Black community was coming together. Many different people from different cultural groups, ethnic groups, were coming out to support. And these protests were very effective in getting a lot of attention. And there was a sense of celebration. And it was also very creative, with people doing a lot of art. The signs were all very different. They were colorful, they were creative, they were inventive. So there was a strong sense of creative spirit coming through in people's expressions. So then I went to the CHOP zone. And now it had already been established. It had been going on for some time. So I got there, say, at the back end about a week before it was dismantled by police.
How was the Chaz zone different from other protests that you had been to?
There was a police precinct where there had been a massive protest. I hadn't been there at the time, but I heard there was like thousands of people. And it was it was so frenetic and so much going on there that the police actually decided to abandon that precinct and go to another one. They felt like they couldn't handle, daily police business because this was going on day after day. So what some of the protesters did was say, well, they're leaving. We're going to take this over, and we're going to declare this to be they called it the Chaz or the Chop Zone. This was different in that it was an occupation where people had put up tents and people were staying there. There was an area right in front of the police station, the police precinct, where there were tents, and then down about a block away, there was a big field that had tents, and it also had a community kitchen where they were feeding anyone who came up. There were barricades that actually the police had put there to control traffic as a safety thing with all these people protesting to direct traffic away. They had announced that they wanted to come back and take those barriers down. They wanted the protesters to leave, but the protesters did not want those to be taken away. So they started to do things to like cut the wires so that the truck, the machine that would pick those up couldn't pick it up. And they started to put board up to kind of make a wall around. And they had guards, people who were self-designated guards around the area. There was people carrying guns in the Chop Zone. And that was scary. And what was scary about it is that a couple of the people were obviously had mental health issues. And I had been told that a number of people who had been there before left because it was just getting too crazy for them.
Were people getting assaulted, or what was it like? Because from what I recall, there just was no police presence, and there's all these people walking around, and people who live there were afraid to leave their homes or go through the neighborhood.
I'd say for the most part, people were pretty safe, during the day. But yes, there is a phenomena that happens that when there's a protest site and it's dangerous for the police, or the police perceive it's dangerous, they will not come out there unless they are prepared to come in riot gear, 50 or more of them at a time. I think the term is it's a red zone. I think that's what it's called. I have to look that one up to my memory on that one. So it creates this zone where criminals know that the police are not going to come out, because not only do they have to come out at 50 or 100 at a time, they also need ambulance services in case the protesters fight them, and the arrests. Somebody gets injured, either the police or the protesters, and the fire department has to come out in case somebody starts a fire. So it's a huge, large, expensive production. Police are not just going to come out a few at a time, because also this was very, very unique to the Northwest, to Seattle and Portland. The protesters were, a number of them, of course not all by any means, but a number of them were extremely hostile towards police, where they get right up in their face, they scream the most horrible things, very, very aggressive. So it's very, very frightening for the police. And, unfortunately, there were several times where I saw fights break out, or where someone was having a medical emergency, and I called the police, or I called for an ambulance myself. And I was very frustrated that they wouldn't come there. It was like, okay, you need to get this person 3 blocks away, and then we can send an ambulance. Well, when someone's, having what seems to be a stroke or an epileptic seizure, and, there's no vehicles close by, or the roads are blocked off, trying to get them to safety is very difficult. And there actually was 2 murders and an additional assault that was so bad it seemed like the boy was going to be left incapacitated. I don't know what happened with him. I have not been able to get information, but 2 people were killed, and almost a third. And I wasn't present when that happened, but I came into camp a couple hours later, and I did interview protesters who had been part of that scene.
Do you feel this was kind of a social experiment for what happens when law enforcement just abandons an area and the public is just left to their own devices?
This was a situation where there were 2 young boys, both African American. They had, one of them was from the area, apparently, and one had come from another state, actually to join the protest. They had been living in that area I described that was like a park or a field, like a block or 2 away. They had been tent camping. Well, apparently, and this is something that I heard from 2 friends of theirs that held a vigil right across from where they were killed, which was right in the protest zone by the police precinct. So according to them, the 2 boys had found a car with keys in it, or somehow they got hold of a car that wasn't theirs, and they were kind of joyriding around the area. And then they wanted to go. They were looking for something to eat, but they couldn't figure out how to get around the area with the barriers. So their friend told me that she was giving them directions to go to a fast food restaurant when they ended up in front of the tents that were right in front of the precinct. It was the middle of the night. The protesters thought that they were under attack. I guess they had heard some backfiring of the car. They had, they have walkie-talkies and different ways to communicate. And people were scared with this car driving around. And because several people were carrying weapons, they just started to open fire. Apparently, the protesters thought they were under fire, but there was no weapon. Weapons that were found with these boys, and one was like 14, the other was 16.
And with all of that, did you feel like they accomplished anything? Like what was accomplished through this whole social experiment? I mean, it wasn't supposed to be a social experiment, but essentially that's what it was, with these people now occupying parts of Seattle.
Well, for one thing, we see massive projection, which is a term. I'm also a depth psychologist. It's projection. Everything that they were saying about the police, they actually became, and how horribly tragic and ironic that here it was the lives of 2 Black boys that were lost, and they weren't intending to hurt anybody. They were kids being kids, messing around. So yes, what happens is in these protest zones where people are sleeping in particular, they feel the need to protect themselves. Because there could be criminal elements or counter protesters. The tensions it's tense enough at a protest that lasts a couple hours during the day. But when people are sleeping there night after night after night, and this was in an area that's quite rough, that's known for having a high level of violence in Seattle. So, but wherever they are, people feel scared. And so there becomes self-appointed guards, people that maybe have that archetypal drive to play policeman, to play guard, maybe to play hero. And they try, but they're not, most of them are not qualified. They're not professionals, they're not trained, and they're sensitive and they're paranoid.
Did you feel that setting up the CHOP zone or some of the darker elements that happened really needed to? Could the movement, and if I remember correctly, the Black Lives Matter movement was parallel to the George Floyd protests? These were happening together, I believe. And
well, that's a good question. And I use the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter protests really and interchangeably. Although Black Lives Matter does refer to a particular organization. So yeah, we could distinguish, but basically the protests that people were having around George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. A couple months after that, she was murdered in her home. Trayvon Martin. There was a lot of different people that they were memorializing, and then just in general, standing up for police brutality.
So do you feel like they could have still made the headway that they did without some of the more darker aspects of these protests?
Well, I think number one, the protesters have messages that they want to get across. And so before you can deliver your message, you have to get attention. And so this was a way of getting ongoing attention. And the more either on one hand, like noise or disruption, or on the other hand, the more art, the more beauty, the more music. There's all different ways to get attention, and I would say both was going on in the CHOP zone. And then there was also people, who were very sensitive to the cause of raising awareness about police brutality towards the Black community, and a lot of other kinds of discrimination that has been very inherent and going on for a long time. So there were people that would come out different. It was like different groups would arrange a rally, and say, show up at the end of the CHOP zone at 7:00, and we're going to go and march. And so people that really had nothing to do with the CHOP zone would come out too. And most of those protests, were fine, or they would do a vigil for somebody. Oh, now I'm remembering there was actually somebody else who died, a couple of people who died, who they were protesting on the freeway and they were hit by a car. It seemed, at first they thought that maybe it was intentional, but I think it was determined that it was not an intentional hit. But that was very scary for protesters and very sad, because the people who had been killed had been a big part of this one group. So at protests like this, it's not always just one group of people. There's people who come and then they'll join each other sometimes. Sometimes it will be pretty separate. It gets pretty complicated.
If I remember correctly, in some of the states, the people took to the streets and were burning down businesses and homes. I know that you weren't part of, I don't think you were covering those, but I think right after George Floyd died, there were entire cities being burned.
Well, it wasn't entire cities being burnt. Minneapolis, it definitely degraded into what we would call a riot. And there were stores that were broken into. There were fires that were set. I was not in Minneapolis. So what I'm sharing is from the news. But I did go to Kenosha, and I'd say Kenosha. Now, I do think it's really important to point out that most of the protests around the country were not violent at all. And so to answer your question, I think it was because it was so ubiquitous. There were so many people that were protesting across the country and really across the world in different cities. And it happened kind of all at once. I think that in itself was very effective. And that the protests kept happening. You know, it wasn't just one night, but it went on for weeks and then for months. So I do not think that any of the violence was necessary. And, burning cars and burning buildings, like in Kenosha, where it does get on the news, but it turns any kind of violence, turns people off and turns people against the protesters. And I can tell you that the protesters I spoke to, particularly African-American protesters, were just horrified at any kind of violence. In fact, when I was in Portland, there was one night where some people that I would call anarchists got an American flag and were burning and had a small circle and were burning an American flag. And this was late at night, like around midnight. And this had followed what was like a beautiful rally with hundreds of people had gathered in front of the courthouse. There were speakers, and then most people started to leave. And so this was what I'd call the more anarchist crowd that were specifically out there to have clash, to have a fight with the police.
Let's break that down. So, because most of us in our everyday life aren't encountering anarchists. What is an anarchist? So, there's really people that are anarchists. Tell us about this.
Oh, yeah, yes. There are many, probably millions of people who ascribe to an ideology of anarchy. And then, of course, I'm not an expert on it, just based on, conversations and what I've heard and the little bit I've read to try to figure out who the players are at these protests. There's, different types of anarchists. There's some anarchists that just believe in, they're like the Joker from Batman, who are just trying to wreak havoc as much as they can to disrupt the power structures, to just cause as much mayhem as they can to blow things up. One of the things about these protests is it's very difficult to say who is there, especially with the people who are causing mayhem, because they tend to wear masks and cover themselves, and they don't introduce themselves. So these people appeared to be skinheads, but they looked a little bit more like frat boys, skinheads. They didn't quite look like the other anarchists. I had not seen the people who identify as anarchists actually burning any flag. So these were people who specifically came to the site to do that. So it's hard to say if they're just trying to turn people against other people. But a woman, I came up to this African American woman who'd given a beautiful speech, and I asked her if I could take her photo, and she said, "You could take my photo, but I want to do a trade with you. You can take my photo, put it anywhere you want, but you need to go buy a fire extinguisher and help me put out this fire.
What is the goal of that? Like to cause mayhem, and what is their goal?
And you should probably interview anarchists for this. I'd say some don't have a goal any more than this is fun. And in Portland, when it was time where most people were going home and the protesters were getting tired, they wanted the battle. It's a game. Do you remember playing Capture the Flag when we were kids? Well, it has that quality. There's people out there with drums. There would be people with a boombox. This is actually quite funny, quite surreal, and quite concerning all at the same time. But they would blast the stormtrooper music from Star Wars. And someone, they might throw bottles, they would bang on the gate, anything to draw out the police. And then the police would come out in mass, and they would say they would officially declare this is an illegal protest. You must disperse, you must leave, or you're subject to arrest. And then people wouldn't leave, and so the police would start with the tear gas. Now, I had come out there specifically because I had heard on the news about Trump sending in federal agents, and that federal agents were, ripping people off the street, essentially kidnapping them. And the federal agents were in unmarked uniforms. So each time I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. It was pretty intense with the feds.
I remember that you came to visit and you had bruises all over your body. And I had actually never seen that many bruises on somebody before. Was that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, well, yes. And so let me back up. So I got in my car. I'd come back to Santa Barbara where I live. I got in my car. I drove 16 hours straight to get to Portland. I was wearing a sundress, and my normal sundress and my sandals. And I go and park my car near where, I've heard that something's happening around the courthouse. So I parked my car, and as soon as I parked my car, it looks cloudy. I thought it was foggy around. And I see two people with umbrellas, like getting down, but in front of my car, like they're hiding, in between cars, and they have umbrellas. So I'm like, oh, this is Portland. Is it raining? Right? So I get out of the car, and all of a sudden I see what looks like stormtroopers, like crouched down, like a line of them. And they, I'm in sort of a narrow street, and they're walking by me, like crouched down. And they looked like military stormtroopers. They were wearing really it looked like military uniforms. I'm like, this is really weird. And then I see, these clouds, and I'm like, wow, these are really low standing clouds. And all of a sudden, I realized that I can't breathe. Like it was the scariest thing not to be able to breathe. It was like the one time I had been scuba diving and my respirator fell out of my mouth and I didn't know, and my lungs were filling up. I was blinded, like the worst burning that you can imagine. And I was just in shock. I fell to the ground. And luckily there was people who saw me, and they came over and they started putting eye drops in my eyes.
Why were they directing this at you? Or you just got caught in the crossfire?
So yeah, I was caught in the crossfire. Basically anyone who had just, driven up. Like this is a residential neighborhood. There's shops, businesses, homes. So anyone else who would have just come and gotten out of their car, there was that much tear gas. But I do have to say, I remember now that one of these agents tossed a tear gas canister at my feet.
Okay, so were these just regular Portland police, or who you had said before they were federal agents, or who were they and why were they doing this?
Right, so these were federal agents who we still don't know what agencies they were with, because a lot of them didn't have markings on their uniforms. Some people said Homeland Security. So some people said that they brought them up. They were border guards, working on the U.S.-Mexican border. So basically they took like tough guys in different departments and put them in uniforms and gave them very minimal training, is my understanding, and they set them out. And the police were told to step back. And the police are used to, there's apparently a lot of protests. This is not a new thing in Portland or Seattle. And the police are very, well trained. There's police on bicycles, there's police on horses, police on, on foot.
This was not the Portland police. They stepped back. These other people came in. They didn't identify themselves. There was no way to tell who they were. That in and of itself, even before you get what their behavior was, but to have people acting in a law enforcement position where you don't know what agency they're representing, that's a huge problem. And, it's just unfathomable that would be happening in the United States at this time. But now, and then you also came home with bruises, like you had people shooting rubber bullets at you. How did that happen?
So I'd say I was probably in the area for like 12 days altogether. It's probably tear gassed about 30 times, multiple times each night. I got more used to that, and with my gas mask. But what happened was one night they were particularly violent. Now, remember there's a big crowd of protesters who are screaming things. People have freedom of speech even to say mean things, but I guess they had it. And they came out. I saw them grab someone. I don't know. I didn't see this person do anything, but I can't say if they did or not. But I saw them grab them and throw them down a flight of stairs, like cement stairs, and just mass. Yeah, the federal agents. And then I saw them arrest a woman and very roughly throw her to the ground, handcuff her from her hands behind her back. And I was standing there, and I was trying to de-escalate the scene. Like I'm like gentle, like you don't have to hurt her, So that I was saying that, but I don't know if they could even hear me. So it was that night. But later on, the agents were going to the back. The police precinct was on the other side of the courthouse, and so they were going in that direction. So the federal agents, in a line, they started to retreat, and they were all the way down the block. And me and several other journalists who were very well marked because we wanted to distinguish ourselves from the protesters. With all the confusion, it's really important to do that. So I had press, I had specialty clothes made, press on my hat, press on my T-shirt, my camera bag. Everyone else is marked, to the hilt. And we decided that all the journalists were going to walk together at the side, and go walk towards to see what the federal agents were doing. The protesters were, they were behind us. So we start walking, and all of a sudden I feel the worst pain I have ever felt, and I fall to the ground. And another another journalist is like, shake it off. You've been shot. Shake it off. Like, you have to keep walking, and it kind of helped me to go. But I had the biggest bruise I've ever had on my leg, and I was, for days, I stayed in bed for several days in the hotel before I came out.
Yeah, by the time you came to visit, I could not believe the size of those bruises. I just never seen bruises like that on anybody.
So that's why it was so, and I got a full face of it with having no idea, what was going on. I just showed up in the middle of the night, and then I got goggles. This journalist gave me goggles, got me a gas mask. Actually, I had to go back to my hotel. I was really sick, and I called an ambulance. We called an ambulance to have me checked out. But I was okay. So the next night, I got the goggles and the gas mask, and I was more prepared. But you'll have to see the video because it was crazy. And it's like people are wearing costumes, or people have their shirt off. The people have umbrellas. They use umbrellas, or there'll be people walking around with blowers, leaf blowers, to blow the tear gas back at the police.
So a couple of questions on that. So why did people have to keep going out? Like, obviously there's these agents, they don't want people out on the streets. They're trying to take back the streets. Could people just have gone home?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, if the feds had just not come out, if the police had just not come out for a couple nights in a row, people wouldn't have come out. Like, they were coming out that late of night just to clash with the police. It was very obvious. That was it. But at the same time, the protesters, who, once again, I would call more the anarchists, they were trashing the place, like the park, the buildings with the graffiti, totally trashing the place. So, yeah, so it's hard to say, do you not come out and do you allow that? Like, how do you get a hold of it if people are bent on that? So it definitely escalated, and I would say it seemed to be a game on the side of these protesters and the police. But I do want to emphasize that, the majority, the hundreds and hundreds of protesters who had been out earlier, the sane people that were not there because they wanted to cause a problem, but were there because they wanted to get the message out about, against police brutality, they would leave by that time. I finally left because I think I was out for like maybe another 2 nights after that. And there was the amount of tear gas and how violent it was getting. Like, I remember I had plotted out, like, okay, when they come out, so that I can photograph this, I'm gonna hide behind this tree, or this electrical box, that kind of thing, But it was like I had to. I was trying to. It was a war zone. Basically, like that, it was a war zone.
Okay, so I just want to raise a couple more points or ask you a couple more questions, and then we'll move on to what's happening today with protests around college campuses. But one thing I do remember is some footage you showed me, and I could not believe my eyes, because there were this line of police, and some of the officers looked really young. At the time, my own son was, I think, maybe about 20 years old or so. And I saw many police officers, both male and female that reminded me of just, basically they almost looked as old as my son or even, a little younger, teenagers. And they're standing there with their riot gear on. They're standing in line. They were just quiet. They were not saying anything. They were definitely trying to just be very still. And there was a whole line of them, like maybe about, 20 or 30. And meanwhile, these protesters were in their face and they were like some just yelling at them at the top of their lungs and shouting profanities and terrible, terrible things at these officers. And the officers, at least from the footage that you took, they were just standing there. And I was like, oh my God, like how long can a person handle somebody else just like, abusing them like that? And they're just supposed to stand there. And, at what point do they just break?
And once again, this was not happening in Washington, D.C. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., a lot of the most of the police officers were African American. And very cordial. They were hanging back, kind of watching if they were needed. But there was never anything like that needed in Washington, D.C. In Kentucky, I went twice, once for the Kentucky Derby. Once there was a big memorial for Breonna Taylor. Same thing. There was there was lines of riot police. And there was actually very heavily armed. There were black militias. There were white militias. The police, the National Guard was there too. Everybody had machine gun, not everybody, but, each of the groups, there were people in each of the groups who had machine guns. But I have to tell you, it was like they were carrying machine guns. Like the most polite protesters I have ever seen. So polite that it was almost like, is this really a protest? Because like beyond. So self-control, everyone knew that this could be the most explosive thing. And there was none of that. I think a lot of this, what I'm seeing is depending on where in the country it really speaks to how people were raised. Most of the people who are out doing things that you'd consider to be offensive or dangerous are young people. They're teenagers, they're young adults. There's exceptions, but, so I think people in the South tend to be raised more to respect authority more. So what I saw in Portland and Seattle, like I just really want to emphasize that this was an anomaly. However, and I'm sure we'll get to this, what I've been seeing with the pro-Palestinian protests here in California are reminding me very much of Portland. UCLA was very, very shockingly to me reminiscent of Portland.
Why don't you start off telling us about where you've been recently in terms of the college campus protests? And then what have you observed that's similar or different between what's happening now and the protests that you attended previously?
Well, after October 7th, when Hamas went into Israel to the Nova Music Festival, killed, raped, injured over 3,000 people, kidnapped over 250 people from over 20 different countries, dragged them back to Gaza. After October 7th, I was walking down the street, down State Street in Santa Barbara, and I saw a group of protesters carrying Palestinian flags, very angry, walking extremely quickly, and I don't remember what they were shouting, but it was something that just like kind of made my brain freeze. This was like maybe a week after October 7th. There was something very different about this compared to the protests that we have in Santa Barbara. There was this sense of hostility. It was like this dark cloud over the protesters. So that stood out to me. So I Googled to see who had organized the protests, what this was about. And that's when I came across a woman's name, and right away my intuition told me to look more into who she was. And I found out that she was a very experienced political operative in 2 organizations. So that's who was organizing and shaping them. And there's been a lot now out in the news about this, but if you go to different places, like I went to UCLA, USC, Berkeley, Stanford, and here, I've been here several times, the University of California, Santa Barbara, and you will see a uniformity, the same flags, the same signs, the same chants. I actually found at UC Berkeley, literature that was, just posted for anybody walking by that describes that there's different phases of the operation. And the initial phase is to disrupt airports, transportation, universities, disrupt the United States, and to turn people against each other, turn the right and the left against each other, lob on to these other movements, and namely the Black Liberation Movement. They're specifically writing on, this is part of the plan that you can see in the literature that they pass out at the University of California, Santa Barbara here, right front and center on the table at their encampment, which is like a football field area. There's a desk, and they call it the Welcome Center. And right at the center on the desk is a picture of a man in a keffiyeh, a headscarf, with a machine gun, and it says Anarchists Guide to Palestine. And then when you open it up, there was just one page, and the page talked about how to link the BLM movement with the Palestine movement, and it's recommended that people say chants that tie the two together and then bash the police in the chant, death to the police, and this is how you're going to ride the wave of the George Floyd protests. And then it says at the very bottom, don't lose sight of our mission. And our mission is freeing Palestine equals death to America. That's the anarchist mission. But this is what made these protests, I think, very different from anything else I've seen, is that it is not grassroots. That the organizations like JVP and Code Pink, they were ready to go on day one, everything in place, and the networks between the jihadist groups, the anarchists, that they were already established, and they're working together. Of course, at the end goal, if they ever achieved what they're out to do, which is to, dismantle the U.S. government, of course they're going to be fighting an anarchist and, a radical jihadist is going to have vehemently opposed goals. But initially, the goal is all the same, to take down the U.S. government. And
you're saying that people that are protesting on these college campuses are not distinguishing between being on an American college campus and being in a war zone. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for people to actually see these encampments, to actually go to them. Most people are not even going to them. And to me, this is very concerning because then there's just stories about them. At UCLA, when I got there, which was May 1st, the night that the police came to clear them, to clear it out, it's about a football field parameter between two major buildings. One was a music hall, and they had put plywood around the whole perimeter. They had boarded up the doors of the music hall and the other building with plywood, all kinds of other material for barricades. But they were bringing in, there was probably, for 12 hours, one car after another bringing in sheets of plywood and boxes of supplies, of gas masks, of goggles, food, clothing, things that could be used as weapons. It was like the most organized assembly line of bringing materials in. There was hundreds and hundreds of people inside the camp, which you could only enter through a narrow opening, and they had guards around it. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people outside the camp who weren't going in, but were screaming, were chanting, supporting them. Will be free. From the river to the sea. From the river to the sea. The police were there for hours and hours, just announcing that that people had to leave. You know, that this was an illegal protest, that they were going to be coming in and arresting.
Were these students?
A lot were students, professors, but a lot were outside people. I'd say like 50%. So hundreds of people. There were people in full burqas. There were, at one point there was people praying, down on the ground doing the prayers. There must have been about 50 people doing that. There was some people wearing like Black Lives Matter shirts. There were people who were wearing shirts that had pictures of assassins on them that I've photographed. Everyone was wearing the headscarf, and the headscarf, by the way, was a headscarf. Not all Palestinians, the women wear headscarves, but not that pattern that all the protesters are wearing across the USA. That pattern was a headscarf that was worn by Arafat, who was head of the PLO, who refused a two-party solution, peace state, when it was offered. But after he wore that, there was the first woman jihadist who hijacked an airplane. She made that headscarf popular. The amount of graffiti was unbelievable. And as they knew the police were going to approach on this beautiful building, they're putting death to Israel and death to the police, and from the river to the sea, the basic stuff. There's like the anarchists and the jihadists tagging together all over the place. I got inside the camp, but only because when two men started to move in and push me, and I had my camera rolling, and I was like, "Do not touch me." I showed them the camera, like, "Do not touch me." And they're like, one guy's like, "Well, you can't come in. We're not letting you come in. You have to move out of the way because we have to get the supplies in." He's like, "You're going to get arrested tonight anyway." And I'm like, "I'm not getting arrested. I'm a journalist. I refuse to move." Finally, someone said, "Let her in," because we just we have to get these people and the supplies in. When I was there for a few hours, and then all my camera battery was dead, so I left to go charge it. When I came back around midnight, and I was considering going back in, but they were saying to everybody, if you come back into the encampment, you have to agree to two things. One is violence, and two is getting arrested. They repeated this over and over and over to all the people who were walking up to that narrow opening to enter the camp right before the police were getting there. All of those.
And they're saying this to students too, like the students that are there, they want to show support.
Oh yeah. Yeah. This is anyone who wanted to get in. Students, people who had come in from the street. There was union people that they had invited to come who had done like a rally earlier in the afternoon. To everybody, we are planning violence, and you will get arrested. So you have to agree to that before you come in the camp.
The people that are saying this, like, is there like a hierarchical structure? Like you could tell that there's like people who are supervising these efforts, saying that, who's saying this to the people?
So the people who were acting as guards to the entrance of the camp, I don't know what their role was, and I don't know. At some point I would like to do interviews, but more interviews, but because they won't talk to journalists, it's very hard to get anything but our own, our own direct witnessing of it to get the real story, because I left shortly after that, and that's when the police moved in. So I wasn't there. The police had been outside, but when the police started to break through the barricade and come in, I wasn't there. So I've had to know what happened. I've watched the footage. There was a lot of news anchors there. All the Los Angeles news stations had anchors that were staying, because it was obvious that the police were going in. So there's tons of footage. Anybody can look at this, but you will see like all out fist fights, battling the police with objects, with hands, fighting. And all of this preparation for that day, at least, was to try to keep the police out. People actually really thought that they were going, from what I could tell, they really thought they were going to keep the police out. I think people who had been to other protests before knew this would only slow them down. But whatever, they prepared for a battle and a fight. And a lot of people were injured. A lot of people, I think 200 people were arrested. A lot of police were seriously injured from the news reports. Now, this becomes very important for what has happened after, to know this.
And what has happened afterwards?
The protesters, there are several people who were like high up in the organization of them, who are also high up in the organization of unions. One union in particular, the United Auto Workers Union, which is very large. It's at least 100,000 people, all different industries, but in particular, a subset of this union are graduate student workers and researchers. So anyone who works in a laboratory assisting professors on any kind of research, anyone who's a TA, you've been a TA, right? Anyone who teaches class, has a staff position, is part of this union. These protesters convinced union members to go on strike in the name of these protesters that had been in the primarily it was the people who had been in the UCLA encampment that were arrested. And so they got an entire powerful union to back them. And how they did this is they sent out emails to people who were not there, who have no idea what's going, not paying attention to most of this. But they sent out emails saying we were peacefully protesting, and the police came and arrested people without cause. What was the harm of our protest? Their protest took up a football field area. To go from one part of the campus to another without being able to walk through their walled city. I did interview a Jewish student who was being prevented from getting to his class on time. Are you the only counter-protester out here right now?
No, I'm one of the 5 counter-protesters here right now.
Are you scared?
Not at all. We don't need to be scared of them. They're trying to intimidate us. They wear masks. They try to cover their identity. And cowards who cover their identity don't deserve our fear. We'll not be scared of them.
Was it true that you really couldn't get to class because of the
Absolutely, it was true. They set up their own checkpoint and they didn't let me go through, and they forced me to walk around the entire school to get to class. That is true.
Did you actually get to class?
I did, but I was very late.
Is there anything else you want people to know?
Yeah, I cannot wait till LAPD comes in and arrests all of these people. Thank you.
Because you had to walk like a half mile around the encampment. There were so many people in between the people inside the encampment and outside, day after day after day. Thousands of people chanting at the top of their lungs. The night before, there was clash with counter-protesters.
And now, we only have a few minutes left. What were they chanting? And do you feel that their presence is really stopping students from being able to have their education, their very expensive education?
Absolutely. To have to walk by, and the signage is so offensive. The signage about kill ACAB, all cops are bastards, kill cops, death to Israel, globalize the Intifada, from the river to the sea, which means eradicate Israel. All of that in people's faces 24/7. That is not what and this is going all the way back to me saying, like, they're acting like the war is right here. All of that 24/7 is so disruptive for students to be learning. And not only that, I really got, when I was at USC, the University of Southern California, which is quite close by, and a bunch of students were arrested. At least that campus, they were able to, there's gates all around that campus, and they were able to close the gates. There were still a lot of people in there that shouldn't have been, but at least they could close the gates there. But when I was trying to find my way out and I wandered around campus, I was walking into dormitories, and it occurred to me, like, these students who are very vulnerable, they're sleeping, they live there. This is their home. This isn't just a place they go to for a few hours once in a while. They live there, and all that's there. And when you consider that the protesters are largely supporting Hamas, they're chanting, globalize the Intifada. And for anyone who's listening to this that doesn't know the word Intifada, Intifada is a violent uprising that has always included suicide bombings, hijackings, murder. So people who are and also there's signs all over that said, by any means. So imagine going to college, especially if you're Jewish, but even if you're not Jewish, if you're not identifying as one of the people in there, you don't know who is going to set off bombs, right? You don't know, right? That's the messaging. Well, and it also switched several months ago. They stopped chanting ceasefire, and they stopped the signage of ceasefire, and they started to chant, "We will win this war. We will win the war." So they're taking up Hamas's cause. And so when people, even on Nextdoor, after I posted something, people are saying, oh, they're peaceful. They're peaceful. Well, if all peaceful means is, someone isn't punching someone or shooting someone in the face, that has happened. I was hit by a man one of my first times at UCSB. But aside from that, it is not peaceful to have people scream at you, shove signs in your face when you're just walking by, and to have to hear chants. Imagine hearing 1,000 people chanting, the only solution is global intifada.
It hadn't even occurred to me that it's not just, some of these urban campuses where students, commute to school, but yeah, we lived in dorms for a good part of our undergraduate education, and I could only imagine what that would be like to have all these people on campus. And and it is pretty unfathomable that they can be shouting these slogans, and meanwhile, the naive students who don't even understand the meaning of these words, the meaning of these symbols, I think that's the problem, is that we can all be compassionate to the Palestinian people who, don't want to have any of this happening, and do feel, very hedged in and, going through just horror right now in the middle of a war zone. We can all be compassionate, and, at face value, it makes sense to want to do everything possible to end this. But I do know we have a mutual friend whose son is going to school at DePaul University in Chicago. And he was saying where he saw a change between people saying that they were pro-Palestinian to being anti-Zionist.
That's right. That's the messaging. Well, and it also switched several months ago. They stopped chanting ceasefire, and they stopped the signage of ceasefire, and they started to chant, "We will win this war. We will win the war." So they're taking up Hamas's cause. And so when people, even on Nextdoor, after I posted something, people are saying, oh, they're peaceful. They're peaceful. Well, if all peaceful means is, someone isn't punching someone or shooting someone in the face, that has happened. I was hit by a man one of my first times at UCSB. But aside from that, it is not peaceful to have people scream at you, shove signs in your face when you're just walking by, and to have to hear chants. Imagine hearing 1,000 people chanting, the only solution is global intifada.
In the minute we have left, what do you see is needed, or what is the solution right now? Or where are we headed with all of this?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think the universities have to get control of their universities. There are written procedures, there's applications for holding protests and rallies. And I am all for that. Obviously, what I've shared, before, I very much support protests. when they're civil and peaceful. And the other night, when a group of people dressed totally in black and masks went to Gervitz Hall on UCSB's campus, they took it over. Actually, they went in early morning. They terrified the janitorial staff. They pushed them out. They barricaded themselves in, and they took over the building for 2 days. You could see people completely in black masks on the roof. They could have been snipers. They could have been anybody, right? And the university didn't clear them out for 2 days. And then when the police came, they were told in advance and they escaped. But the encampment is still there. So I think that they should just follow their own rules. The chancellor originally declared this as an unauthorized encampment. People shouldn't be setting up tent cities and then blocking everyone from it. Nobody else has been allowed to do that. So follow their own rules. Allow people to have protests, but a protest can last an hour. It can last 2 hours. It can be contained, and there can be people in place. The police right now, there's not enough police or security guards to be watching 24/7. It's an extremely dangerous situation because on public universities, the public is allowed to come. And there's all kinds of people coming.
So just to summarize, and for anyone tuning in who didn't hear the whole first part, where 13 years ago you started off as a protester yourself, documenting Occupy Wall Street and moving on from there, where you really identified with the protesters and were initially coming in from that perspective.
But I also saw, when I was part of the Occupy movement, I saw why it imploded. It blossomed so quickly. It was amazing. And then it imploded within a month. And that's because everybody started with the basic tenet that we were going to be peaceful and civil. But after just a couple of weeks, there were subgroups that started to form that wanted to do violent action, wanted to do illegal things, and things that would hurt people. And people like myself and most of the other people were like, no, we're not going to do this. And when we saw that we couldn't control them, that no matter what, they were going to do what they wanted to do, that the rest of us had to leave. That was one reason I left. The other was that there were political operatives who had been part of rebellions in South America that started to hold conference calls and started to get control of each city's Occupy website. They're basically taking over and controlling and giving orders to people. In that case, they wanted people to go to the ports and to wreak havoc at the ports. And at that point, I was out of there. Yeah, the shipping ports where shipping was happening, which in Alaska, with native people, mostly who live remotely, the only way that they get food is from shipping. So, it's like whatever their purpose was. And in Occupy, I'd say that was the greatest flaw, that nobody could agree what the goals were. It was to the 99% against the 1%, to raise awareness about the inequity of economics in the world. I think that was it in general, but beyond that, people couldn't agree on that. And so the infighting and the peace-loving people versus those willing to do violence, which was a smaller group, but it was relatively a remarkable number. Maybe it was 12 or 15, but 12 or 15 people out of a couple hundred they can do a lot of damage. So this is the nature of protests, I learned later. But there's reason for the government, for law enforcement, for citizens to be concerned. It doesn't mean that we stop protests, but they need to be contained and monitored. The other night, while at least a dozen, if not more, of these masked people were taking over an entire building, where the next day people were scheduled to have their finals and they couldn't. When people are in there, I go over to the encampment, the front desk where there's like 4 people sitting, and I'm like, hey, can I ask one of you some questions about what's happening here? And they were like, it is 2:00 in the morning. Like, look at the time. You want to interview someone at 2:00 in the morning? People are sleeping. Like, that's what they said to me in the middle of campus, like really the middle of campus. Right. There's masked people. They could have guns. They could have bombs. Even the person one of the men on the roof, I'm like, can I interview one of you? And he went and, stepped away, and he comes back and he's like, sorry, we're all going to sleep right now, but if you come back, you might be able to interview someone tomorrow. Like, even the people who had taken over this building are like, they can't be bothered to give an interview because it's 2:00 in the morning. We have to distinguish. It's a continuum between protest and terrorism. Where is the line between protest and terrorism? For me, the line is how we feel. The line is fear. There should not be a reason for fearing protesters. If you are fearing for your life, if you're feeling like something is happening here that's so wrong, our life is threatened, which I know countless Jews and other people who feel this way, it has crossed the line from a protest to terrorism. And we have crossed that. I have observed we've crossed that line. I think that line was being crossed in Portland, sometimes in Seattle, certainly in Kenosha when 300 businesses were burned down in 2020. These are all, now I'm talking about going back to 2020. It was far the exception than the rule then, but these encampments are the rule.
With that, we are going to have to go now. Thank you so much. We'll have you come back, and where we want to hear about your psychic experiences and how they've contributed to you taking pictures of so many leaders of the world and getting the perfect photo, and we'll do that soon. Thank you.
New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.